I took back my childhood home from my evil stepmom, and she had no idea what was coming. And then, when my stepmother called to tell me she had sold my childhood home, her voice held that smug glee she always reserved for cruelty. "I sold your house to teach you a lesson about respect," she said, dragging out each word like she was delivering some moral punishment instead of announcing theft. "The new owners move in next week," she added, practically purring. I remember standing in the middle of my Denver apartment, the sun slanting across the hardwood floors, holding the phone against my ear like it might shatter if I squeezed it too tight. But I didn't panic. I didn't scream or cry or beg. I smiled. Because Rita didn't know what my father had done before he died. She had no idea that nearly a year before his diagnosis, my dad flew across the country just to take me out to breakfast in a greasy spoon diner in downtown Denver. He stirred sugar into his coffee with trembling fingers, looked me straight in the eye, and said, "When the time comes, I want you to go to Harold." Then he handed me a slim envelope with my name on it and said, "Don't open this until I'm gone, and don't tell Rita you have it." The tone in his voice was somber but calm, like he was giving final instructions in a covert operation. I should back up, though, because none of this would make sense without knowing how things got to this point. My name's Savannah. I'm 31, and I was born in Charleston, South Carolina, inside a house that's been in my family for generations. My dad was an architect with a love for tradition and precision, and my mom was a designer who could walk into a room and immediately know what needed to change. Together, they restored the old Victorian home on Ash Street into something spectacular. Not flashy, elegant. It had charm that creaked in the floors and whispered in the crown moldings. Every Sunday morning, while other kids watched cartoons, my dad would drag me from bed to walk me through the rooms like he was giving a museum tour. "See this?" he'd say, running a hand along the curve of a banister. "Craftsmen carved this by hand in 1902. You can still see the chisel marks if the light hits just right." I loved those mornings more than I ever let on. He used to hoist me up to touch the pressed tin ceiling in the parlor, always saying, "This is legacy, Savannah. Not money. Not stuff. This house." When I was 13, my mom was diagnosed with stage 4 ovarian cancer. Everything went quiet after that. We used to have music in the mornings, Ella Fitzgerald or old Van Morrison, but that stopped. The house became too big, too dark, like it knew something was wrong. My mom spent her last months in the sunroom, surrounded by her orchids, drinking weak tea and stroking my hair when I cried against her lap. After she passed, it was just me and my dad for a while. We grieved in opposite directions. I buried myself in books and silence. He buried himself in blueprints and work. For a time, it felt like we existed in the same space without really seeing each other. And then Rita came. He met her at a gala for cancer research, poetic, I guess. She was loud in a way that made people stop what they were doing and look. Rita was orange tan, bleach blonde, and all perfume. She was the kind of woman who took selfies during funerals and called it content. My dad started smiling again around her, laughing. I couldn't hate her for that. At least, not at first. But it didn't take long to see her true colors. Rita had no reverence for the house, no understanding of what it meant. "Ugh, it smells like old wood," she once said, wrinkling her nose in the library. She started suggesting renovations before she even moved in. "We could knock out this wall, make it more open concept." I remember blinking at her like she had just threatened to set the house on fire. They married after just 10 months of dating. I was 20 at the time, still in school, pretending I was fine while I watched Rita slowly sandpaper every inch of my childhood down to soulless drywall. She threw out furniture that had been in our family for decades. Repainted my mom's office a sterile gray. Replaced brass light switches with something modern and smart. And my father let her. When I tried to talk to him about it, he just looked tired. "She's trying to make it her home, too," he said. I was already sliding toward the door like he wanted to escape the conversation. So I did what I always did. I disappeared. Finished college, moved to Denver, kept my distance. We talked, occasionally. Text here and there. A phone call every other month, always when Rita was at some networking event. Then came the cancer. The same week I accepted a job at a historic preservation firm, I got a call from my Aunt Diane, my dad's sister. She was crying and angry, and I couldn't even understand her at first. "Savannah, he's sick," she kept saying. "He's got pancreatic cancer. Advanced. He's known for weeks, And she didn't tell you. I flew back to Charleston the next day, arriving unannounced. Rita opened the door with a wine glass in her hand and fake surprise on her face. "You should have called," she said, standing half in the doorway. "Walter's resting." From behind her, I heard my dad's voice, hoarse and faint. "Is that Savannah? Let her in, Rita." That was the last time I saw him conscious. I stayed in my old room, which Rita had been planning to convert into a Pilates studio. For 3 weeks, I made soup he couldn't eat, rearranged his medicine cabinet, held his hand while he slept, and watched Rita pretend to be Florence Nightingale whenever someone stopped by. But at night, she disappeared to charity dinners, business meetings, a spa retreat at one point. It was in those gaps of absence that my dad and I talked. Sometimes he could barely speak. Other times he was sharp as ever, whispering instructions like a man preparing for a long journey. "Harold has the deed," he said once, while I was tucking a blanket around him. "The real one, not the one she knows about." Another time he gripped my wrist and said, "Whatever she says after I'm gone, don't believe it. Go to Harold." When he died, Rita planned the funeral like a red carpet event. All her clients came. The food was catered. The music was some instrumental version of Coldplay. She gave a eulogy that mentioned his firm's awards, but not my mother, not even once. I stood there in my black dress, numb from grief, watching her accept condolences like a celebrity and thinking, "This is not your house. This is not your story." But she thought it was. Which is why, when she called me months later to brag that she had sold the house, I let her speak. I let her brag. I let her hang herself with her own words. Because she didn't know that a trust existed. She didn't know Harold had paperwork. She didn't know that the deed had been transferred out of my father's name years ago. She didn't know that the key hanging around my neck, my great-grandfather's iron key with the worn edges, still opened that front door. She had no idea what was coming, and I couldn't wait to watch it unfold. When I hung up the phone after Rita's smug little monologue, I didn't cry, scream, or even curse. I simply walked to the kitchen, poured myself a cup of black coffee, and stared out at the Denver skyline as the sun slipped below the buildings. For years I had prepared myself for this day, knowing full well that her greed would eventually rear its full head. What I hadn't anticipated was how calm I'd feel once it finally happened, like I'd stepped into a scene I'd rehearsed for 1,000 times. The next morning, I called Harold, my father's attorney, the man who had known me since I was in pigtails. I told him what Rita said, how she claimed to have sold the house, and that she believed the sale would go through in less than a week. There was a pause, just the sound of Harold breathing through his nose, and then his voice came through low and measured. "Let her believe that. We'll let her walk into the trap on her own feet." A part of me felt sick keeping the secret, pretending to be outmaneuvered when I held the ace the whole time. But another part, stronger, colder, knew that anything less would give Rita a chance to wriggle out from under what she deserved. This wasn't just about property. It wasn't even just about my father's wishes. It was about dignity, about reclaiming everything she had tried to erase piece by piece. 3 days after that call, I flew back to Charleston. I stayed with my Aunt Diane, who had always loathed Rita but kept her distance out of loyalty to my father. "You look like your mother more and more every day," she said as she poured me a glass of sweet tea. I smiled and looked around the kitchen, filled with old mixing bowls and faded dish towels that hadn't changed since I was a kid. "She'd be proud of you," Diane said. "Your dad, too. He made mistakes, but he never stopped trying to protect you, even when he was stuck." We spent that night talking through the plan, how Harold would coordinate with the title company, how we'd wait until Rita made it official. We wouldn't intervene early. We'd wait until the buyers had their pens ready and the ink was just about to hit the paper. That was when we'd strike. The only thing I had to do until then was wait and watch. My father had always said that patience was a builder's best tool. "You can't rush the right foundation or everything above it will fall," he used to tell me. That voice echoed in my head as I walked past my old house the next morning. It looked almost unrecognizable. Rita had painted the shutters some hideous gray-blue color and installed a tasteless metal sculpture in the front garden where my mom's rose bushes had once bloomed. But the bones were still there. The second-story bay window, the gables, the little scallop trim under the roofline that my dad had restored himself. Rita could never change those things. Not permanently. I walked slowly, taking mental notes, until I noticed the for sale sign staked into the lawn like a victory flag. It had Rita's agency name on it in bold script, with her grinning headshot underneath. My stomach twisted with a mix of rage and amusement. She had no idea she was about to crash headfirst into her own hubris. I snapped a photo and texted it to Harold with one word: live. Over the next few days, I kept a low profile. I avoided any direct interaction with Rita, though it took every ounce of restraint not to show up at one of her open houses and casually mention who really owned the place. Instead, I let her bask in the false glory, watched her show the house to prospective buyers, listened to updates through the grapevine from neighbors and old family friends. According to Mrs. Hartley, the widow who lived next door and liked to sit on her porch with a pair of binoculars and a thermos of whiskey, Rita had hosted 3 showings and a virtual tour in less than a week. She's gutting the place like it owes her money, Mrs. Hartley said over the phone one night. Tore down the old library shelves. Replaced the fireplace mantle with some hideous steel thing. Honestly, I hope she chokes on her commission. I thanked her and made a note to send flowers once the dust settled. Then came the message from Harold. Closing scheduled for Thursday. Be ready. I didn't sleep much the night before. I sat in Diane's guest bedroom staring at the ceiling, flipping the silver key in my hand like a worry stone. I wondered if my father had known how bad it would get. If he had realized how completely Rita would try to erase everything he built. Or maybe he had known exactly. And that's why he spent those last months orchestrating this final act of poetic justice. On the morning of the closing, I dressed with deliberate care. Navy blazer, crisp white blouse, dark jeans. Professional, but not stuffy. I pulled my hair back, applied just enough makeup to look like I hadn't spent the entire night wrestling with ghosts, and slid the key into my pocket. Diane drove me downtown in her ancient Volvo, gripping the wheel like she was ready to personally drag Rita out of the title office by her extensions. Do not let her bait you, Diane said as she pulled into the parking lot. No matter what she says, you've already won. I nodded, trying to swallow the knot in my throat. She'll bluster. She'll play the victim. But remember, she doesn't own that house. She never did. She just tricked herself into thinking she could rewrite history. We walked into the office together, but I stayed in the hallway with Harold while Diane went up a separate stairwell. The receptionist didn't recognize me, which was perfect. We waited until Harold received the signal from the closing attorney. Everyone was there, papers laid out, check in hand, and then we stepped into the room like it was a stage, and we were the final act. Rita's face went through 5 expressions in 10 seconds: surprise, confusion, amusement, indignation, and finally fear. She tried to recover with a smile, but it was brittle, more a baring of teeth than anything warm. "Savannah," she said, standing slowly. "What are you doing here?" I took my time answering. I walked to the table, looked at the documents, then turned to the 2 buyers sitting across from Rita. "I believe you're trying to purchase a home from someone who doesn't legally own it." That was all it took. Harold laid out the trust documents, the property deed, and the official notice. The buyers looked stricken. The attorney looked embarrassed. Rita looked like she might actually explode from the inside out. "This is absurd," she said, her voice pitching higher than normal. "Walter left everything to me. It's mine." "Actually," Harold said, "the house was removed from his estate years before you were even married." Then he calmly produced the trust paperwork signed and notarized, complete with county recording stamps. The air went out of the room like someone had punctured it with a pin. The buyer stood. "We'll have to consider our options," the husband said, grabbing his briefcase. Rita tried to salvage the moment, tried to argue, threaten, twist the narrative. But there was nothing left to salvage. The truth was in ink, signatures, and seals. The truth was written years ago by a man who had spent his final days undoing the damage done by marrying her. As we left the room, Harold placed a hand on my shoulder and whispered, "This is what justice looks like when it wears a suit." I didn't speak. I didn't gloat. I just looked at Rita one last time, watched her mouth open and close like she wanted to scream but couldn't find the words, and I turned away. I had the key. I had the trust. I had my father's legacy. She had nothing but the echo of a deal that would never close. I don't know what I expected when Rita stormed out of the title office, but part of me thought she'd at least make an effort to fake dignity. Instead, she left trailing insults, stilettos stabbing the marble floor with each furious step, barking at her agent like the whole thing had been a sabotage. In truth, it was just not the kind she could defend against. It wasn't a sneaky trick or a forged paper slipped into a file. It was my father, planning with ruthless precision to ensure she'd never get her claws into the one thing that mattered most. And the best part? She had no one to blame but herself. After she was gone, the buyers, the Hendersons, lingered awkwardly by the coffee machine while Harold and the title rep finalized paperwork acknowledging me as the actual property owner. I offered to still sell the house to them directly, and they accepted with some relief. Honestly, we just love the house, Mr. Henderson said, adjusting his glasses. We don't care who we buy it from as long as it's legal. That last part was clearly aimed at the mess they'd nearly stepped into. We shook hands, and I promised to have my attorney reach out to theirs by the end of the week to discuss terms. Rita's lawyer, a man who looked permanently stressed and wore a tie too tight for his neck, had tried to play damage control in the aftermath. My client requests a reasonable period to vacate the property, he said, voice brittle like he knew how absurd it sounded asking favors now. Harold gave a polite but firm counter. 2 weeks. And the rightful owner, Miss Reynolds, will require immediate access to begin the transition. I could have asked for less time. I could have had her thrown out that very afternoon. But I didn't want a scene. I wanted clean closure, something sharp and final. 2 days later, I returned to the house for the first time since the showdown. It felt like entering a sacred space that had been violated. The white paint Rita had slapped over the wood paneling looked even more offensive now. She gutted the library, replacing the cherry built-ins with white laminate and bizarre floating shelves. In the dining room, the vintage chandelier was gone, replaced with some modern art-looking light fixture that resembled an upside-down octopus. I wandered room to room in stunned silence, trying not to scream. But the bones of the house were still there, beneath the cheap paint, the tacky updates, the soulless staging furniture. My father's presence lingered in places Rita had overlooked. The intricate window latches he had restored himself. The brass light switch covers he had refused to replace with plastic. In the upstairs hallway, I ran my hand along the banister he had once polished every weekend. For all of her efforts to erase him, she had failed where it mattered. That night, I slept in my old bedroom, now stripped of all personality. Rita had painted it the same bland gray as the rest of the house, the walls bare, the window seat cushions replaced with something generic and stiff. But I remembered it as it had been. I could still see the pattern of my old bookshelf and the scuffs on the wall. I could still feel the outline of the stickers I'd once plastered to the closet door, even though they were long gone. Memory has a way of restoring what paint tries to hide. The following morning, I went into the master bedroom. This was the room I dreaded most. It had belonged to my parents, then to Rita and my dad, and now it sat like a mausoleum of poor taste. Sleek gray furniture, cold lighting, carpet that was both too white and somehow already stained. But I wasn't here to assess decor. I was here for what my father had hidden. Behind the awful reproduction of Monet's water lilies that Rita had insisted on hanging above the fireplace, there was supposed to be a safe. My father's final secret. I pulled the painting down with shaking hands. Behind it, the drywall had a faint seam. My heart hammered as I pressed on it gently. A small panel popped open, revealing a recessed metal safe. I knelt down and entered my birthday, June 29th. The lock clicked open like it had just been waiting for me. Inside were several velvet jewelry boxes, a thick envelope, and a smaller one with my name on it in my dad's precise handwriting. I opened the letter slowly, savoring the moment even though my eyes were already burning. My dear Savannah, it began, if you're reading this, then the house is finally yours. I wish I could have been there when you walked through that door again. I wish I could have stood beside you when you reclaimed it. But I hope, more than anything, that you feel the love I left behind in these walls. This house is more than wood and stone. It's a history, a promise. And I protected it for you. The jewelry boxes contained my mother's pieces, her pearl earrings, the sapphire ring she wore on their anniversary, a delicate gold bracelet that still smelled faintly of her perfume. Each item was tucked into velvet like a sacred offering. The manila envelope held old family documents, birth certificates, my grandfather's architectural sketches, even the original deed to the house signed by my great-grandfather in 1924. There were also photographs, the kind Rita had sworn didn't exist anymore. There was one of my parents on their wedding day, standing under the oak tree in the backyard. I cried then. Not polite tears. Gut-wrenching, face in my hands crying. After I recovered, I opened the final section of the envelope, my dad's personal journals. He had written about the decline of his marriage, about the isolation he felt as Rita tightened her grip on their life. He wrote about regrets, about mistakes, about love. And he wrote about me. Savannah still sends me photos of her projects, he'd written once. She has her mother's eye. Every time I see her work, I feel like I've done one thing right. I didn't read all the journals that night. It felt like a betrayal to speed through them like a novel. They were sacred texts, something to be read slowly and with reverence. Instead, I climbed into bed with the letter in my hand and the key around my neck. For the first time in years, I felt like I was home, not just physically, but emotionally. My father had made mistakes, yes, but he had also made this final act count. He had ensured that what mattered most wouldn't fall into the wrong hands. The next few days were spent sorting through what Rita had left behind. She'd made sure to clear out anything with real value, of course, but in her arrogance, she'd also left clues. Receipts for furniture bought on the estate's dime, evidence of financial mismanagement, and a truly petty note she'd scrawled on the back of a receipt. Maybe now she'll understand who won. I took a photo of it and laughed. "Oh, Rita," I whispered, "you never understood the game." Harold came by that Friday to check in. I showed him the safe contents, and he smiled like a man who had finally seen justice work the way it was supposed to. "Your father really thought of everything," he said. "He knew she'd try to strip this house down to its bones. But he also knew you'd be the one to rebuild it." I didn't say anything. I just nodded and walked over to the fireplace, running my fingers along the original mantle that Rita had miraculously left untouched. Later that afternoon, as I stood on the back porch looking out over the overgrown garden, I heard the front door open. I turned just in time to see Rita's car pulling into the driveway. She walked into the foyer like she still owned the place, trailing perfume and attitude. "I'm just here to get a few last things," she said, barely glancing at me. I nodded toward the boxes she'd left in the corner. "Help yourself," I said. "Your 2 weeks are almost up." She paused at the stairs, looking at me like she wanted to say something sharp, but nothing came. Just silence. For the first time, she had no power, no leverage, no audience. She picked up her boxes and left without another word. That night, I locked every door, turned off every light, and sat in the dark with nothing but the key in my hand and the sound of the wind against the windows. It felt like the house was breathing again, slowly, quietly, returning to itself. It wasn't just mine legally. It was mine in spirit. Rita had tried to rewrite history. My dad had made sure she never could. The morning Rita moved out for good, I stood at the top of the stairs and listened as the front door slammed behind the last of her overpriced movers. She had made the whole thing an ordeal, of course, overpacking her car, barking orders, making loud comments about how gracious she was being to leave behind anything she didn't totally hate. She even handed me a sealed envelope before she left, saying it contained truths about my father I clearly wasn't ready to face. I took it without blinking, thanked her with a smile that made her jaw tighten, then dropped the envelope straight into the cold fireplace and lit a match. I watched the flames devour it while the house finally exhaled. With Rita gone, the silence returned. But this time, it wasn't the suffocating kind that filled the house after my mom died. This silence was warm, restorative, like the place itself was grateful to have been reclaimed. I walked slowly through each room that day, barefoot on the hardwood, taking inventory of everything that had survived, everything that hadn't, and everything I could still restore. I'd negotiated a 2-month grace period with the Hendersons, the buyers, so I could oversee partial renovations before they moved in. They agreed to my conditions easily, especially once I offered to knock a little off the final price in exchange. They were good people. Mr. Henderson was a structural engineer, and his wife had a background in historical preservation, which immediately endeared them to me. They didn't want to gut the place. They wanted to honor it. That was all I needed to hear. During those 2 months, I worked harder than I had in years. Every morning, I rolled up my sleeves and tackled a new project. Restoring the old bookshelves in the library, sanding and refinishing the hardwood floors Rita had covered with hideous synthetic white carpeting, and reinstalling the antique doorknobs and hinges she'd replaced with cold stainless steel. In the evenings, I'd sit on the back porch and read my father's journals. One entry at a time. I learned things about him I hadn't known: his fear after my mom died, the guilt he carried, the way he had slowly realized that Rita wasn't a partner but a performance. There were nights I cried, sometimes from exhaustion, sometimes from grief, but more often from a strange kind of gratitude. Even in his final year, even under the weight of illness and regret, my father had been planning. He knew he couldn't undo everything, but he could leave me something unspoiled, something honest, something worth fighting for. He could leave me the house, our history, untouched by Rita's greed. The neighbors began to stop by again once word got around that Rita was gone. They brought coffee, pastries, clippings from their gardens, and stories. Stories I hadn't heard in years, stories Rita had tried to erase by keeping everyone at a distance. Mrs. Hartley told me how she and my dad used to sit on the porch after my mom passed, drinking bourbon and talking about nothing. Mr. Fields, the elderly man 2 houses down, handed me an old blueprint my dad had given him, a renovation plan for the attic he'd never had the chance to complete. I framed it and hung it in the stairwell. One Saturday, I went up to the attic with a flashlight, thinking I might find the space to be as bleak and hollow as the rest had been. Instead, I found the hidden panel behind the chimney exactly where my dad's letter said it would be. Inside was a cache of family items, stuff I thought Rita had trashed long ago. My mom's worn copy of Pride and Prejudice, the wooden music box my grandfather had made me, full photo albums from my early years, my father's architectural awards she'd once called dust collectors. I sat there for hours surrounded by memories. Some of them painful, sure, but all of them real. All of them mine. No stage lighting, no sales pitch, just moments that survived. The night before I left the house for good, I stayed up late in my father's old study. I'd restored his drafting table, reorganized his shelves, and returned his desk to its rightful spot near the bay window. I lit one of the old oil lamps and sat in his leather chair, breathing in the smell of old paper and pipe tobacco that still lingered. I didn't want to say goodbye, but I didn't have to, because the house wasn't leaving me. It never had. I was carrying it with me now, in my memory, in the blueprints, in the key still hanging around my neck. At dawn, I walked from room to room, touching the door frames, the window sills, the walls. I whispered goodbye in each one, not because I was letting go, but because I was giving thanks. Thanks for the memories. Thanks for the strength. Thanks for reminding me that legacy can't be bought or stolen. It can only be protected by love and time and deliberate choices. Before I locked the front door for the final time, I slid a new envelope into the kitchen drawer. One labeled simply, "For the Hendersons." Inside, I left a letter explaining the house's history, its quirks, and the care it had always deserved. I told them about the secret panel in the attic, the original blueprints in the study, and the names of the neighbors who would become friends if they let them. And I ended it with a request: make new memories here, but don't erase the old ones. They're part of what makes this place alive. As I walked down the porch steps, key around my neck, box of journals under my arm, I didn't feel like I was walking away from something. I felt like I had finally closed the last chapter of a long, complicated book, one filled with loss and betrayal, but also with redemption, justice, and above all else, love that never truly left. A few weeks after moving back to Denver, I received a letter postmarked from Charleston. For a second, I thought it might be from Rita, one last desperate attempt to rewrite history, but the handwriting was too careful, too neat. When I opened it, I found a thank you card from the Hendersons, now settled into the house and already planting a garden out back. "Your letter moved us to tears," they wrote. "We feel like caretakers now, not just homeowners." I read it 3 times before setting it on my bookshelf beside my dad's journals. The house was no longer mine, but it was finally in the hands of people who respected its story, and that, more than anything, gave me peace I hadn't known I needed. Life settled into a rhythm after that. I dove back into work with a clarity I hadn't felt in years, designing spaces with intention instead of just chasing deadlines. My boss noticed the shift immediately. "Something's different," he said one morning, watching me sketch a custom molding detail. "You're building like someone who finally found their blueprint." I just smiled and kept drawing. Every now and then, I get an update from Aunt Diane about Rita's latest delusions. Apparently, she tried to file a lawsuit against me that was dismissed before it even hit a courtroom. Then she claimed she'd been swindled, told anyone who would listen that the trust was forged and my father had been manipulated. But no one believed her, not even the few friends she hadn't alienated. Her name became a cautionary tale in Charleston real estate circles, a reminder that arrogance without foresight rarely ends well. And me? I moved forward. Slowly, deliberately, without bitterness. I still keep the iron key on a chain around my neck. Not because I need it anymore, but because it reminds me of everything my father taught me, not just about houses, but about resilience, legacy, and making things right when it matters most. Sometimes, on quiet mornings, I pull it out and just hold it in my hand, grounding myself in the knowledge that justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes, it moves quietly, like a well-drawn blueprint or a beam perfectly placed beneath the surface. To anyone reading this who's ever had something taken from them, by force, by manipulation, by someone who believed they could rewrite truth with power or money, I want you to know it is possible to take it back. Not with vengeance, but with patience. Not with screaming, but with preparation. My father didn't leave me revenge. He left me proof. And with that, I got everything I needed. Thanks for listening. And if you're standing on the edge of your own fight, just know this: you don't need to shout to be heard. Sometimes, the quietest victories are the ones that last forever.